You are now listening to Radio Merdog.
Hillary Clinton, vampire. Barack Obama, vampire. Bush, vampire.
What up? Welcome to Radio Merdog. Today we're going to be taking a look at a classical mythical creature. And this is one that subsists by feeding on humans' vital essence. And these beasts have been present in European folklore for many, many centuries. And they've been shared in the collective unconsciousness ever since. For truly millennia. They've taken many different forms over time, but you probably know them as pale, gaunt creatures with big fangs. And today, we'll be learning more about the vampire. But before we get any more into the vampire, today's episode is powered by Aspire Energy. Clean energy that actually tastes good and doesn't leave you feeling like you just drank battery acid. Zero sugar, zero crash, and all the focus you need to dive into whatever weird corner of the internet we're exploring next. And because Aspire is showing love to the Radio Merdog crew, you can get 20% off your order when you use code MERDOG at checkout. That's code MERDOG for 20% off, MERDOG. So go get energized, Aspire style. So let's jump back into vampires. Vampiric entities have been recorded in cultures all around the world for millennia, going back all the way to the ancient Mesopotamians, Hebrews, ancient Greeks, and even Romans, who all had their own different tales of demonic entities and blood-drinking spirits, which are generally seen as the precursors to modern-day vampires. Even though vampire-like creatures occurred in these ancient civilizations, the folklore behind what's known as the vampire today comes mainly from early 18th century Central Europe, in particular Transylvania, which is an area encompassing central Romania. For the most part, vampires are revenants of evil beings, suicide victims, or witches, though they can also be created by a malevolent spirit possessing a corpse or a living person who's been bitten by a vampire themselves. And just to clarify, a revenant is a spirit or an animated corpse that's been resurrected to pretty much haunt the living, and the word comes from the old French word revenant, meaning returning. So it's returning to the living, something undead. So, during the 18th century, the term vampire was really popularized in Western Europe following reports of mass hysteria, where people were drawing upon some pretty deep pre-existing folklore of these creatures. And just to clarify, mass hysteria is basically when symptoms are spread of like an illness generally throughout a group of people, even when there's no infectious agent responsible. But the illness doesn't have to be a virus necessarily. It doesn't have to be a physical thing. It can be an idea. And in this case, the delusion that vampires were around led to many, many people being accused of vampirism. And generally these people were killed by being pierced in the heart by a stake. And I'll go way deeper into all of this later on. This is just a brief little overview. But there are quite a few different regional variants of vampires as well. The most famous being the Strigoi found in Romania. And in fact, the Bram Stoker's, is it Stoker or Stoker? Okay, it's Bram Stoker, not Bram Stoker. All right, Bram Stoker's Dracula most closely resembles a modern interpretation of the Strigoi, and they're generally seen as like troubled spirits that have become restless in death and have risen from the grave. And these are the types of vampires that can do things like transform into a beast or a bat or become invisible, and they definitely are known for sucking blood out of people, so be on the lookout for those. They kind of suck, literally. Though I do think it is pretty neat how the lore of the vampire has been around for so long, but in some ways stayed relatively unchanged. I mean, nowadays, most people look at it as a fictional entity, I mean, there aren't a lot of people, especially in the Western world, who are scared of vampires. It's a pretty ridiculous thing. But the traits of the vampire have transferred over to some other things, namely cryptids like the chupacabra. I mean, some people called the chupacabra a vampire beast because of how it was supposedly sucking the blood of livestock for its own vitality like a vampire. And there's been a lot of ways people have tried to rationalize the belief of vampires. And, looking back at it historically, a lot of people think that it was really a way to try and explain the mysteries of our existence after death. And as I'll get into later, a deep misunderstanding of the human body's decomposition process. So, the most prevalent modern interpretation of the vampire, which is, usually it's like a charismatic, sophisticated, aristocratic seeming human-like dude. It mainly comes from this 1819 book called The Vampire. So it's like The Vampire, but spelled with a Y, by this guy, John Polidori. And the book follows the Lord Ruthven, who is like a charismatic, captivating aristocrat who just kind of suddenly appeared in London high society. And then he goes on to travel with this young man named Aubrey, who we meet. And he's looking up to him, he wants to follow him around and learn about his lifestyle. But then he eventually finds out about Ruthven's real dark nature, which is, of course, the fact that he's a vampire. And if you read the book today, which I did for this, it seems like it's totally cliche and rife with common tropes, but it's kind of cool reading old literature like this because it's really the progenitor of all these tropes. All of these traits of vampires, they come from this book. And also another book, the one released in 1897, Dracula by Bram Stoker. Not Bram Stoker, which borrowed some of these ideas from Polidori's novel, but then he further solidified some more of them. And it's really the quintessential vampire novel. If you're going to read any vampire book after this, definitely check out Dracula. It's pretty cool how many things have came from it. So most of what we see as vampires in the modern day comes from Dracula. But before we start looking at modern vampires, I want to go back into the deep-rooted belief found centuries ago of folkloric vampires. It's difficult to make a single definitive description of this old-school vampire, though there are quite a few common elements found in most of the legends, and you can sort of average them all out and come up with a pretty disgusting entity. I mean, they were initially seen as pretty fat and bloated in appearance and described as being purplish or red in color, and it's thought that a lot of these characteristics were attributed to their recent drinking of blood, which would often be seeping from their mouth and their nose when they were in their coffin or shroud, and they would often be clad in the linen shroud they were buried in. But a lot of the reports talk about their teeth, hair, and nails having grown a pretty substantial amount, giving them this weird, unkempt, just gross appearance. Though it is worth noting they weren't really documented as having fangs. That kind of came later on with the Bram Stoker and Polidori stuff. But another thing is that there's a lot of reports of chewing sounds that would emanate from the graves of these supposed vampires. But all of this, of course, begs the question, like, what causes vampires? I mean, this has been subject of heavy debate for centuries now, and it really varies quite a bit between different cultures. I mean, because vampires, well, the most famous ones are from Eastern Europe. They're in Chinese culture, they're in African, they're in Western Europe, like they are all over. So, in Chinese and Slavic traditions, any corpse that was jumped over by an animal, usually a cat or dog, but really any animal, they would be feared to turn into one of the undead. So a body that had not been treated with boiling water, they would also fear to be at risk of turning. So it was commonplace for them to basically boil people after they die so they wouldn't turn into vampires, which makes total sense to me. In Russian folklore, vampires were said to have once been witches or people who had rebelled against the Russian Orthodox Church while they were alive. But for the most part, in the folklore, the most common method is just being bitten by another vampire or being possessed by a malevolent spirit, kind of Revenant style. And that's kind of generally where it's thought of for, because to be bitten by another vampire, that vampire had to have been bitten by one, and so on and so forth. So kind of the first one in the line of biters is thought to have been possessed by a pretty mean-spirited spirit, I guess. So that's how you become a vampire. How do you prevent it? And there were a lot of different practices that people began to do to prevent their loved ones from turning into a disgusting undead monster. And one widespread method was burying the corpse upside down in conjunction with placing objects like sickles or scythes near the grave, which they did to satisfy any demons from entering the body and to appease the dead so they wouldn't want to rise from the coffin and haunt and mess with people. And I thought it was interesting how similar this practice was to what the ancient Greeks did to pay the toll to cross the river Styx in the underworld. So if you didn't know, the river Styx is basically the river that ancient Greeks would have to cross and, into the underworld after they passed away. So to cross the river Styx, they would place an obulus into the corpse's mouth so they can pay for their passage, which is basically just a coin. And it's also speculated that the coin may have been intended to ward off any evil spirits from entering the body. And that is supposedly something that directly influenced the 18th century vampiric folklore. And the 18th century is when things really got wild in the world of vampires, so we'll be getting there soon. And the Greeks had another similar tradition for dealing with the vraikolakas, which are another harmful undead creature. They would basically use a wax cross and a piece of pottery, and they would inscribe the words, "Jesus Christ conquers," and place them on a corpse to prevent the body from becoming infected with vampiricism, which I think is awesome. I love that. In some other parts of Europe, they would pretty grossly sever the tendons at the knees, and they would place poppy seeds or sand on the ground, or really any type of seed, near the gravesite of somebody who they would think might turn vampiric. And the whole purpose of the granules was to keep the vamp occupied, all night, just counting the grains, which is just hilarious to me that they would just assume the vampire would just spurg out and go all OCD and just count seeds and get distracted doing that and ignore doing their usual vampiric nonsense. And it is kind of neat to look at the correlation between vampires and OCD type behaviors, which are pretty often found in vampire stories. So I thought that was cool. And this idea, that was really common in Eastern Europe, but they even did it in China, where they would say if a vampiric being came across a sack of rice, they would be fully compelled to count every grain. So people would place down a sack of rice and then be able to escape the vamp. But if all this failed, you screwed up, a vampire rises, and you're dealing with it, but you're not quite sure. They had some pretty strange ways of figuring out their identity. One of the most infamous ways of finding out which grave the vampire's living in, well, not really living, but you know what I mean, it involved leading a virgin boy, young boy, through a graveyard, riding on a black virgin stallion, and the horse would stop and balk at the vampire's grave and would refuse to go any further. And then if any holes began to appear in the earth over the grave, that was generally seen as a sign of vampirism. And they would identify vampires in graves by them having a healthier appearance than one would expect from pretty much just a dead guy in a grave. Generally, they would be quite plump and well-fed looking and show little to no signs of decomposition, even if it's been far long enough to where they should be barely human looking. And in many cases, they were even described as having fresh blood from a victim all over their face. And they would know a vamp was active in an area through a couple different means. I mean, one, of course, would just be sightings, but a big one is just a pretty sharp uptick in the death of sheep, cattle, relatives, neighbors. A lot of these places in Eastern Europe comprised of pretty small villages, so people started going missing or people's livestock started getting messed with it would be found out pretty darn quick. And they would also sometimes make their presence felt by engaging in some poltergeist-like activities, things like hurling stones and moving household objects, things like pressing on people while they're sleeping, just kind of to freak them out, which I thought was interesting reading reports about that. I don't really get what a vampire would get out of giving somebody a light massage while they're sleeping, but I honestly wouldn't mind that too much. That sounds pretty nice. But when people would identify one and thought there was one prowling around, they would start keeping things on them called apotropaics, which are pretty much items you can use to ward off these revenants. And you've definitely heard of some of these. The most famous examples are garlic, crucifixes, and holy water. I mean, for thousands of years, it's been thought that strong-smelling, pungent plants are able to repel evil spirits, and garlic was also thought to purify your blood, which is important because the way a vampire gets control over you is by corrupting your blood. I did find a pretty interesting report from 1693 where people in Poland and Russia were dealing with some vampires, and when they would be able to figure out which grave the vampires were chilling in, they would bake bread with the vampire's blood mixed into the flour and eat that, or they would just straight up drink the blood, which would grant them the possibility of protection. So it's not even a guaranteed thing, it's just a preventative measure, drinking vampire blood. I wasn't able to figure out how they actually got the vampire blood, if they would just scoop up some dripping from a corpse in a grave would be my assumption, or maybe they did some bloodletting, I'm not sure. Either way, doesn't sound like it was too fun. Some other stories do claim that eating the dirt from their grave would protect you too, which is something prominent in the Arnold Paoli case. And this is one of the landmark cases for vampires. Basically, Arnold was a Serbian infantryman in the 1700s who became a vampire after his death. And he started a whole epidemic that ended up in the deaths of at least 16 people in his home village. And this whole case is super fascinating because it directly involves the Austrian authorities, and the whole case was documented by numerous physicians and officers, specifically two military surgeons who served the Habsburg royalty. And the crazy thing is that they concluded and confirmed the reality of vampires. And the reports made during these events were distributed throughout all of Western Europe and led to the spread of vampiric belief even among the highly educated Western Europeans. The main events that happened with Arnold was that he came to this town, and he often mentioned that he had been plagued by a vampire at a spot called Gosova, which is thought to be a modern-day Kosovo. But he supposedly cured himself by eating the soil at its grave and smearing himself with its blood, that being the vampire's blood. He eventually fell and broke his neck falling from a hay wagon, which is hilarious, honestly. A vampire fell off the wagon and died. Oh, that was funny. And within a few weeks of his death, 4 people claimed to have been plagued by him, and they all died shortly thereafter. Exactly 40 days after Arnold's death, the local villagers opened his grave and saw that his corpse was undecomposed, with all the indications of vampirism. His veins were replete with fluid blood, fresh blood flowed from his eyes, nose, mouth, and ears, and the shirt covering and the coffin were completely bloody. The old nails on his hands and feet, along with his skin, had fallen off, and new ones had grown. His body was red, and his hair, nails, and beard had all grown again. They concluded that he was a vampire, so, of course, they drove a stake through his heart, to which he let out a loud, frightful shriek, groaning and bleeding. They then went on to burn his body and cut off his head. They then went and did the same procedure on the other 4 vampire victims, and almost exactly 5 years later, a similar epidemic occurred in the same town, and more than 10 people died within a few days, some of them in just 2 or 3 days without any previous illness. Their symptoms included weakness, very quickly wasting away, and then sudden death. The locals blamed vampires, claiming that Arnold's original victims had infected the others. After this larger outbreak, the Austrian military sent 2 surgeons to document everything. During this, they exhumed 13 bodies and reported that many corpses were still fresh and had blood in the chest cavity. They also had organs that appeared to be intact and were not experiencing any form of decay. it was officially declared that the deaths were caused by vampirism, and Europe went wild. This event really ignited Europe's 18th century vampire craze, and was a pretty key component in shaping the modern-day vampire myth. So I just wanted to share this story with you because it's just so fascinating to me how well documented of a case it is, and how widespread the story pretty quickly became and is still seen as one of the most important vampire stories. Reading it, though, it does beg the question of what the best methods of destruction are for vampires, and it's generally thought that staking is the most practical method, mainly among South Slavic cultures. And depending on the region, they would use different types of wood. Like, for example, in Russia, they would generally use ash. In Serbia, they'd use hawthorn. In Silesia, they'd use oak. And vampires were generally staked directly through the heart, but in some reports from Russia and northern Germany, they would do the stakings directly through the mouth. And by piercing the skin of the chest, it would really just deflate the vampires, is the way it's described, because they would often be very bloated looking. Decapitation was another method commonly used, mainly in Western Europe, where, things like the guillotine originated. They would cut off the head, then bury it between the feet, behind its butt, or away from the body, just so it had no connection whatsoever. And the methodology behind this was that it would hasten the departure of the soul, which was often thought to linger in the corpse post-mortem. And they would also generally spike and pin the vampire's head, body, and clothes to the earth to prevent it from rising again. Another method commonly used was pouring boiling water over the grave, or just completely incinerating the body until it's just nothing more than an ashy mess. The Romani people, they had the habit of driving steel needles through a corpse's heart, and they would place little bits of steel over the eyes, over the ears, and inside the mouth, and also between the fingers sometimes when somebody was buried. And they were also known to put hawthorn into their sock and then drive a stake between the corpse's legs. So these are all the things that relate to the most modern version of the vampire that's been around since the 1700s. But there does exist even older renditions of the tale. These legends of supernatural beings consuming the blood and flesh of the living have been in pretty much every culture for millennia, and the drinking of blood was generally attributed to evil demons or spirits before the term vampire even came around. I mean, even in biblical lore, the devil was considered synonymous with the vampire. For example, in India, they have the legend of the Vatalas, which are ghoulish beings that inhabit corpses, and those have been around since at least the 11th century. Ancient Persians would depict creatures attempting to drink blood from men on their pottery, which has been excavated countless times. Babylonia and Assyria had the mythical Lilitu, which is also known more modernly as Lilith, and her daughters, the Lilu, who are often found in Hebrew demonology. And demonology is a whole nother topic I'll get into on another day, but it's pretty fascinating, the depth of research that's been done on these demonic entities. But back to Lilith, she was considered to be a demon, straight up, and was often depicted as subsisting on the blood of babies, which gets interesting to something we'll talk a little bit later on in this episode. Adrenochrome. In Turkic mythology, the Ubir was a vampiric critter. It was said that when people heavily steeped in sin practiced black magic, they would transform into Ubirs when they died. And they would basically just take on this bestial form within the graves, and they had the ability to shapeshift between humans and different animals. They could also possess people and seize their soul to fully exert control over their body. So, pretty vampiric. And then also, throughout the medieval period, more myths surrounding vampires began to crop up, and the modern take really began to come to fruition more and more over the centuries. And with the arrival of Christianity in Greece and other parts of Europe, the vampire really started to take on more Christian characteristics, with components like an aversion to holy water beginning to become mainstays in the legend to this day. So, moving on to the 18th century, even though there was generally a decline in older folkloric beliefs during the Age of Enlightenment for a variety of reasons, there was also a sharp uptick in the genuine belief of vampires. So the case of Arnold Paoli, as we talked about before, was one that really ignited the fear of vampire attacks. So there was one case that happened even before Arnold's, and that was of Petar Blagojevic from Serbia. And Blagojevic reportedly passed away at the age of 62 from natural causes, but allegedly returned to life after his death. And then he went up to his son and asked for some food. And his son refused. He was like, "Yo, bro, you're my dead dad. What are you doing?" And then his son was found dead the following day. Then Petar returned shortly thereafter and attacked his neighbors, who then all died from blood loss. And there are many such cases like this, and they kept cropping up all over Europe, and this hysteria was eventually given the name the vampire controversy, which continued for at least a full generation. Many contemporary treatises discussed the philosophical and theological implications of this epidemic, and these treatises thoroughly investigated and analyzed a lot of the evidence for vampirism. Mind you, this is all in the 1700s, and one of the most famous examples was the one published in 1751 called A Treatise on the Apparitions of Spirits and on Vampires or Revenants. And a lot of people who read this, including some pretty famous demonologists, interpreted it as claiming that vampires existed. So it was a pretty common thing to think vampires were a real threat back then, which, fair enough. But there's a lot of weird stuff going on in these Eastern European towns. And really, sightings and rumors of vampires have been consistently around since that craze in the 1700s. And as recently as 2017, people have been accused of being vampires and have been killed. And mind you, these most recent cases were in Malawi, which isn't a place necessarily known for thorough adjudication processes, but yeah, this started in 2002, where 5 people were stoned to death there, and it's happened a couple of times since, so definitely don't suck people's blood in Malawi. But another recent case was in the year 1970 in London. In the famously haunted Highgate Cemetery, rumors began to spread of a vampire stalking the area. So, of course, amateur vampire hunters, which is just such a funny thing to do, to be an amateur vampire hunter. I mean, it really does sound fun to just go around with like a flintlock pistol and like a wooden stake and try to find people to jam the stake into their heart. I mean, I don't know. It does sound fun. Kind of wish I was a part of that. Point being, these people flocked to the cemetery to try to hunt down the vamp. Though, unfortunately, no one was able to find and take down the beast, and I don't know, maybe he's still sleeping in a coffin to this day. Though, of course, some people did capitalize on the event and wrote books about it. Most notably one by the man named Sean Manchester. And this is a guy who claimed to have exorcised and destroyed a whole entire vampire nest, which is honestly pretty impressive, to exorcise a whole den of vampires. I would love to see that. Similar rumors to the Highgate incident started cropping up in January 2005, when there were some claims of a vampire attacker biting people in Birmingham. But I wasn't able to find a whole heck of a lot of info on these bites, just a Guardian article, but, you know, they're probably legit. But overall, there really aren't a whole heck of a lot of modern day vampire cases. I mean, in most of the places in Eastern Europe where the folklore originates, the people living there really just see it as a fictitious thing now. Although there are definitely some smaller localities where vampiric beliefs are still rampant, and sightings and claims of vampire attacks happen frequently still. And it's in Romania, it's still a pretty common practice to dig up corpses, tear out their hearts, burn them, and mix the ashes with water, then drinking it when they suspect somebody's a vampire, which, I mean, imagine doing that in 2025. It's pretty wild, but, you know, different strokes for different folks. Or I guess different Bram Stokes for different folks. God, that was stupid. Well, there really is a wild amount of history to these things, but, like, what is the reality of it? Do they exist? Like, how do you explain things like Arnold Paoli's case? And for a lot of this, there are some pretty good explanations. So the main thing that stands out to me is the state of decomposition that a lot of these corpses are in. And a lot of people throughout history have speculated the overall belief in vampires comes from the people in these pre-industrial societies trying to explain the natural process of death and decomposition, but just not having a real grasp on what's going on. And there's a huge variety of reasons as to why a cadaver may not look like what they might have thought a normal corpse would look like when disinterred when they dig it up. Things like soil temperature and composition play a massive role in the rate of decomposition, and many of the signs are pretty little known. And this has oftentimes led vampire hunters to generally mistakenly conclude that a body hasn't decomposed at all, or more importantly, they might interpret normal signs of decomposition as just signs of life after death, which just isn't accurate. One thing to note is that most of the places that vampires are thought to inhabit are places that experience really cold and harsh winters. And most of the more famous cases take place during the winter time. So during the winter, the overall rate of decomposition slows down drastically when the dirt itself is near frozen and the air is oftentimes well below freezing. And as corpses begin to decompose, they tend to swell from gases that begin to accumulate in the torso, which increases the pressure within the body, which inadvertently causes blood to ooze from the person's orifices, their mouth, their nose, maybe ears, other holes. And this causes them to look plump and well-fed, which is a description you'll see many times. And the changes can be even more apparent if the person was thin or pale before death. Like, for example, in Arnold Paoli's case, an old woman's corpse was noted to have, this is one they thought was a vampire, was noted to have looked far more plump and healthy than she ever looked in life. And the blood exuding from her nose and mouth made the people think she had recently been feasting. Decomposition also causes the skin to darken, which is another trait supposedly found in some vampires. And when a bloated, gaseous corpse gets impaled with a big wooden stake, of course the body begins to bleed, and it forces the accumulated gases to escape the body, which can produce an eerie groan-like sound. And also, post-mortem, the skin and the gums lose fluids and contract, which will expose the roots of nail beds, hair, and teeth, even sometimes other rows of teeth that were concealed within the jaw. And this can all make it seem like they've grown, when in reality it's just more has been revealed. And another factor in all of this is premature burial, which was something that used to happen a shockingly large amount, which sucks. I mean, medical knowledge was certainly nowhere near where we're at today, and people were often declared dead far before they really were. And so they'd get buried while still alive. So many of these vampiric cases have people hearing sounds emanating from coffins, which would then generally be later dug up with fingernail marks discovered on the inside, or there'd be blood smeared everywhere, which is really just, they probably just buried a guy. He was trying to claw his way out and make noises so people would bury him. He'd be hitting his head against the roof of the coffin, his nose getting all bloody. Like, God, that is such a terrifying thing to imagine. But that's not all. Vampirism does have a lot of correlations with different illnesses and diseases, and one that I found out that stands out to me a lot is the link between vampire folklore and this rare blood disorder called porphyria. And basically people with porphyria, they have to consume large amounts of blood to transport chyme, which is a molecule found in the blood. So the thought is that vampires were simply people suffering from this disease, and they somehow instinctually knew that they had to get this molecule found in blood into their system, so they would drink the blood from people. The guy who came up with this theory, he came out later and said he doesn't really think it's legit, so I don't really know. I just thought it was worth throwing out there. There is also a connection between sensitivity of sunlight and sufferers of this illness, but, still doesn't necessarily confirm anything. Another, I think, more plausible link is between rabies and vampires, and there's a lot of correlations between the two. And one is hypersensitivity, which hypersensitivity is a pretty major component of rabies, which would explain the susceptibility to garlic and bright light and stuff like that. And rabies also affects portions of the brain that could lead to disturbances of normal sleeping patterns, which might cause people to live more nocturnal lifestyles, as well as cause things like hypersexuality. And rabies can also lead to a drive to bite others and cause a blood-like frothing at the mouth. And I think it's worth noting that bats and wolves, which are two animals often associated with vampires, are well-known carriers of rabies. And also, once people hit a certain stage, an end stage of rabies, they get this fear and aversion to water. So theoretically, if you were dealing with a guy with rabies who was acting like a vampire, and you flick some holy water at him, he would not be too stoked on that. And there's also oftentimes a pretty overtly political side to vampires. I mean, just look at Dracula, for example. He's portrayed as an aristocrat living alone in his castle with a few confidants and only appears at night to feed on the peasants that live around him. And Voltaire's entry about vampires in the Dictionnaire philosophique, he notes how the mid-18th century coincide with the general decline of the belief of the existence of vampires, but they were now, quote, stock jobbers, brokers, and men of business who sucked the blood of the people in broad daylights. But they were not dead, though corrupted. These true suckers lived not in cemeteries, but in very agreeable places. And this quote from 1764 is incredibly fascinating to me because it shines a light on what I think is the most accurate interpretation of the modern vampire, which is something that manifests as someone that drains the life force essence from others for personal gain. And those are, of course, the globalist pedophile elites and energy vampires who control our world and our global finances. And before I get into any of this, I do want to reiterate, this is a comedy podcast. We're just having fun. Do your own research. And I just want to lightly touch on this topic for now because it pertains a little bit to vampires, but I'll go way more in depth about this in the future. Don't you worry. Once again, this is all for comedy purposes. So one example of the vampires and what they want is something called adrenochrome, which is something that these globalist elites harvest, which is something purported to give them enhanced cognitive capabilities, psychic powers, and enhanced longevity. And the way they get it is from children who they supposedly, the younger the child, the more potent their adrenochrome is. So they harvest their blood and organs, mainly the very young kids' adrenal glands. And there has been a massive suppression by the government and pharmaceutical industries in an attempt to maintain control over the population so they don't know about this information. So it is somewhat difficult to find. And if you try to look into it, you will be bombarded with articles telling you it's all fake QAnon nonsense. And I do just want to clarify once again, this is a comedy podcast. Do not come after me, please. We're just having fun here, talking shop. But it does go beyond harvesting children's blood and organs. Historically, demons and vampires have had a pretty intertwined history, like I'd said earlier, and that is still present today when looking at demonic and vampiric behavior in these certain types of people. We really aren't just living in a world of political and physical resistance. It's a global, cosmic, spiritual battle between those who want to drain us of our life force, our chi, which is another topic I'll get into soon, by the way, and the rest of us. So, did vampires really exist, or do they exist? In a way, yeah, I think so. But it's not necessarily the type that sucks your blood with two big fangs and then goes and sleeps upside down in a castle. But the vampiric archetype has been around for millennia, and I think still does exist in our world. And those who have power over others and exert and wield said power over others for nefarious purposes, whether it be financial, moral, physical, or otherwise, these people certainly do exist out there. That's not up for debate. But whether they can really be considered people or something else is up for debate in my eyes. All right, that's it for this episode of Radio Merdog. If you enjoyed it, please do me a favor, rate the show and leave a review on whatever app you're listening on. It really helps this show reach more people. Use code Merdog at Aspire Energy at aspiredrinks.com for 20% off your order. It's a great energy drink. I highly recommend it. And just a reminder that this is all for your entertainment. This is all just for fun. And I do hope you all have a lovely Thanksgiving, and I'll see you next time. Peace.